In this video, I want to once again solve the problem of counting how many correct answers has a person given. This time I want to use List.Generate and List.MatchesAny because currently we've been treating the entire answer as one segment instead of taking this column and splitting it into each individual answer. I couldn't initially figure out how to do this. The List.MatchesAny function is the key to this solution. I want to first take the answer column and split that into a list of individual answers using the text.split function, because conveniently each answer here is separated by the same separator. This function gives me a list and I can then iterate over each individual answer. I want to add a column to the previous step. After the each here, I'm now inside of the context of adding a column, which means I am in the row context. So for each row, I have access to the current row's items. When I refer to the ID column, I'm then referring to the intersection between the current row and that column. And because I end up with three contexts, that is, I have a row and I have individual answers and I have the list of correct answers, I want to ignore the outermost context, the row context, and I can do that by generating a variable. I then want to use List.Generate, and here I want to use the fourth argument as I've done before, because the list I generate must be as long as there are answers inside of my current row. In the first row I only have 2 answers, here in the third row I have 1 answer, which means I need to keep looping as long as my looper is less than the length of my list. I need to start out by generating my initial, what is the first value inside of my list, which must always be an empty function. I want to store that in a record because I prefer referring to this value by a name instead of an underscore. My looper will start at 0 because I'm doing a lookup into a list, and lists are index 0 based. I want to keep looping as long as my looper variable is less than the length of my correct answers. And this is because I have 2 correct answers currently. My looper starts at 0, so I do a calculation for that item, then my looper becomes 1 and I do another calculation, then my looper becomes 2, which is the length, so I terminate. This will then generate 2 items. I want my next looper to be equal to the current value plus 1. So I want it to be equal to its current value, which is why I have to put it in the square brackets, and then I want to add 1. But the item I print inside of my actual column isn't the looper variable, that is my selector. The selector doesn't have to be associated with the variable here. I simply use looper to know when to terminate and what correct answer I should look into. And here's where I want to use the magical function List.MatchesAny. List.MatchesAny sort of does an OR condition, and I'll go through it at the end of the video. For now, what it does is it will loop through my list, and then it will check if any of the items inside that list satisfy the condition, which will then be a lookup into the correct answers. So my list is then the current answer, which is the column with my list of answers. And then for each item inside of the current answer, here I can specify a function which takes one argument, which is then the current iteration inside this list, which I'll call answer. And that will then go towards, I want to check whether that current answer is equal to the first correct answer. So is my answer equal to a lookup into correct answers using looper as my index lookup. List.MatchesAny will take my list of current answers and then it will loop through it each time asking, is the current item I'm looking at, so the current answer, is that equal to the first correct answer? So is Eminem equal to Eminem? That's a true. Is Tupac equal to Eminem? That's a false. Then this whole function will spit out a list of trues and falses, and List.MatchesAny then says if there's at least one true, then the whole thing evaluates to true. So because Eminem is either equal to Eminem or Tupac, this will evaluate to true, but NF is not equal to Eminem or Tupac, so that will evaluate to false. Likewise, Eminem is not equal to the Smiths, and NF is not equal to the Smiths, meaning both items will be false. I then want to do a sum of this generated column. I can't sum trues and falses. If I try to do that, I will get an error, because it can't apply an operator to logical. So even though, for instance, in Excel, you can interpret true as 1 and false as 0, that's why inside of my function, I have to change this portion. So instead of spitting out true and false, I want to spit out 1 and 0. Alternatively, I could do a list.transform and say that if the value is true, turn it into a 1, and if it's not true, then turn it into a 0. But I'd rather change this function instead of adding a new step that transforms my list. All I have to do is ask if this evaluates to true, then I want to spit out a 1, otherwise I want to spit out a 0. And here I did not mind my parentheses, but that should be fine. Yeah. meaning instead of getting true and false, I now get 1 and 0, which I can then sum. So that was actually it. So before ending, I want to go through the documentation for List.MatchesAny, because I found it a bit cryptic, because returns true if the condition is satisfied by any of the values in the list. So the way I interpret it is that it takes a list, and then for each item in that list, it will apply this function, meaning it's effectively the same as list.transform, but then it performs an action on that transformed list. In this first example, it says, okay, give me a list of 9, 10, and 11, and then it applies a function saying that is the current item in the list greater than 10? So 9 and 10 are not greater than 10, meaning this will become false and false, and then 11 is greater than 10, so this will become true. That means inside of this parentheses, this will effectively create a new list of false, false, true, and then List.MatchesAny says, if any of the items inside that list, if they spit out a true, if there's at least one true, then the whole thing evaluates to true. And that's why I consider this function to be like a logical OR. That is, if at least one of these evaluates to true, then the whole thing becomes true. So, yep,